This is Andrew Hall. You're listening to Dead Hand Radio, a podcast about the Cold War, its history, and the effects it had on our culture, technology, and the future of our world. My guest for this episode is author, researcher, and podcaster Matthew Kresal. His areas of study include Cold War history, space travel, science fiction, and ufology. And his new book, The Silver Archive No. 5, Dark Skies, takes a comprehensive look at the 1990s TV series Dark Skies. On this episode of Dead Hand Radio, Matt and I talk about his book, the Cold War, the space program, and share some thoughts about UFOs, past, present, and future. Hey Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing just fine, sir.
First of all, is that okay if I call you Matt?
Yes, that is fine.
Okay. I don't want to be informal, if you'd prefer to be formal, so.
Matthew, these days is pretty interchangeable. So.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and I'm pretty easygoing, man. This is not really a formal conversation or interview. If you think of it like that, it might make things more complicated. It's just, I am a geek about the Cold War, and I love to talk to people who share that interest.
Oh, sounds fun. I mean, I meant to check out a couple episodes of the show, and I'm sad to say I haven't yet. So it's something I'll definitely do once we get done talking.
I am crushed. How could you not listen? Just kidding, man. So, usually, and you can see the notes there. So
yeah,
I pretty much, I don't read off the notes as if it were a script, but it keeps me on track. I usually do quite a bit of research on my guests before I bring them onto the show and interview them. In your case, I had a really tough time finding information about you on the internet.
Oh, my plan has worked then. My plan has worked.
So you're trying to be invisible?
Not quite. I mean, I was kind of surprised. I got bored recently, as you sometimes do, and you just kind of Google your name, and I was surprised by some of the things that did turn up and how little did turn up. So I'd have at least sent you a bio or something if I'd realized there was so little out there.
You can still send that to me. That'd be fine. Hey, this is going to make for an interesting conversation because it's going to be a getting to know you type of thing. And, I'm always open to, if guests have questions for me, I'm open to answering questions as well.
Excellent.
But I noticed a lot of stuff about Doctor Who.
Yes.
When I Googled your name out there.
Yeah, that seems to be the main focus of my writing a lot of the time, is I have written an awful lot about that particular show in the last 13, 14 years since I got into it. And in a funny way, Doctor Who is what led to my writing the Dark Skies book.
Cool. Well, that leads me to an interesting connection that we share outside of Cold War and UFOs, and that is time travel. I'm not a big Doctor Who fan, so I'll throw that out there as a disclaimer. I don't know that much about the show. I've never seen an episode.
Oh, you're missing out, man. You're missing out.
But I do know it's about time travel. That much I do know.
Yes.
And I time travel as a topic of science fiction has always fascinated me. And one of my guests on this podcast is a guy named Marshall Barnes, and he's a researcher and an engineer, and he feels that he can actually eventually, and he's pretty close to discovering time travel, and he'll have a way for humans to travel back in time in the very near future.
Interesting.
Yeah, you should check out that episode, man. He's an interesting dude.
I will have to check that out.
I think that's episode number 1.
Okay.
So yeah, if you start at the beginning and listen to all my episodes, it'll take you probably about 2 days because there's not a lot of episodes, but my episodes do go kind of long.
Well, it's quality over quantity.
Oh, well, a little both. I mean, my episodes go long, and the quantity is, or I guess the quantity, the number of shows is not a lot, but the length of the shows is really, pretty good length.
Yeah, one of the Doctor Who podcasts I pop up on from time to time, the average episode of it's, I think, about 2 hours. So
Okay. Unfortunately, I probably won't be listening to any of those because
that's quite all right.
Doctor Who just never really interested me.
Yeah,
I was always,
it's an acquired taste.
I guess. Yeah, that's what a lot of people say. And people laugh at me because I'm a big science fiction fan. I'm a big fan of Star Wars, Star Trek, all the 70s, because that's really when I grew up, was in the 70s. But the British science fiction, I never really got into it.
Interesting. I mean, I was born in '88, so I've come to a lot of this stuff retroactively, for lack of a better way to put it. I just sort of, I think part of it too is I just have a general interest in what I think the Brits like to term archive TV. So I watch a lot of older stuff simply out of interest,
Cool.
And enjoying it as well. So
yeah, and since we're on that topic, let's talk a little bit about your background, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So you say you grew up in or you were born in '88, so you grew up in the more or less in the '90s, which, I mean, the Cold War was winding down at that time. So where is it that you did grow up?
I grew up around Huntsville, Alabama, where I still live today. So for those who don't know, it's home to NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where the Saturn V rockets used in the Apollo program were developed and designed. And it's also home to the U.S. Army's Redstone Arsenal, both very big today. And we also have the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, which is like a home away from home for me because I spent so much time there as a kid. It's also the only place in the world with 2 Saturn V rockets, as a matter of fact.
Oh, they still have those? They still...
Yeah, there were 3 Saturn V. There were 2 test flight Saturn Vs that didn't fly as part of Apollo, and they are on display in Florida and Texas. And what we have here, we have something that's called the Flight Dynamic Test Model. So it's basically a Saturn V in full configuration and whatnot, but it's not flight worthy, so to speak. But it has all of the characteristics, all of the engine parts and whatnot to do it. There's some amusing footage on YouTube for anybody who ever gets bored and wants to look for it. This was the one that in 66, 67, they actually assembled it in the vehicular assembly building down at the Cape. And they actually took the thing out to the launch pad, put the thing in place, and literally got, 2 dozen guys around the bottom of it, and they literally shook the thing in place to make sure that when the engines lit up on the Saturn V when it launched, the thing wouldn't completely come apart. So we have that, and we also have a 1/1 scale full-size replica of it that was built in '99 for the 30th anniversary of Apollo 11.
Cool. So is it like a museum out there that you can go visit?
Yeah. It is a very sizable museum out here, where it's a Smithsonian affiliate, as a matter of fact. So if you're a space geek, I highly recommend it. And it's also because it's built on land that was actually taken out of the Redstone Arsenal, was actually donated, as from what I recall, from the U.S. Army. So there's quite a bit of Cold War. There's some Cold War stuff out there as well. There's some Army missiles and a Huey helicopter and a Army mini submarine that was used to recover missile wreckage as well. So that's kind of my background. I mean, talking about me and the Cold War, I was born a year and a day before the Berlin Wall came down. And there's a sort of a story in the family about my first birthday party being kind of interrupted by the news coverage of the Berlin Wall coming down. Because in the middle of celebrating my first birthday, somebody got a phone call from somebody, and they went and turned on the TV to watch the live coverage coming over, I guess on CNN or whatever.
That's cool. That's a cool story. So your first birthday, so you were born a year and a day before the Berlin Wall came down.
Before the wall came down, election day 1988 to be precise. As my parents like to say, it's the only election, the presidential election, they haven't voted in their lifetimes for obvious reasons.
Yeah, and then so Berlin Wall comes down and your birthday is interrupted. I mean, do you have any inkling of a memory of that, or is it just stories from the family?
It's just stories. I mean, I have some memories from when I was a little kid, but that is not one of them. But I suspect, because I was a space geek, like practically from coming out of the womb. I don't know where my interest in all things space and NASA came from, but I grew up around that. I spent a lot of time as a kid and as a young adult at the Space and Rocket Center. To the point that there's pictures of me toting around a stuffed animal I had when I was a little kid, going around to the various exhibits and whatnot that my parents still have. So it was like a home away from home for me. And my interest in all things space eventually kind of went over, I guess, into the Cold War, because so much of what was exhibits there, so stuff from Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, even the shuttle to an extent, was all formed around the Cold War. So as a kid, I would hear all these things about, the Cold War and the space race and Sputnik and all this. And my interest eventually carried over, and I sort of grew out of that a wider interest in the Cold War.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's impossible to separate the space race from the Cold War. They were integral with one another.
Indeed.
In fact, I don't think there would have been a space race if there wasn't a Cold War.
Yeah, I don't think there would have been either. I mean, it's interesting if you look at like 50 science fiction, for example, and there's a book by Arthur C. Clarke called Prelude to Space that I read on Kindle earlier this year. I mean, he was predicting that they wouldn't get the first missions into space wouldn't happen until the 1970s and 1980s. Because there was just no impetus to do it, in terms of spurring on the technological development and the spending of expenditure, really, that would to justify it.
Yeah, how else could you justify that kind of expense?
Yeah.
Because, you just really can't.
Yeah.
Although, if, you were to ask me, I would say put more money into space, even now, because what's out there is way more interesting than what's right here.
Yeah, you'll get no argument from me on there. I am a lifelong proud NASA supporter. I was one of those kids who really wanted to be an astronaut, until bad eyesight, flat feet, and hypoglycemia got in the way. So it turns out I am the last person you want to put on top of a rocket.
Well, who knows? You may get your opportunity, man.
I may, there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. We just a couple of days ago, of course, the first SpaceX Crew Dragon splashed down with, astronauts on board.
That was very cool. I watched that live on YouTube.
Yes, I did too.
That was awesome.
It was incredible to watch.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of weird to think. In some ways, I think Arthur C. Clarke talked about around the time of the 20th and 25th anniversaries of the moon landing, so that would have been 89 and 94, that in some respects what had to happen was the technology had to catch up with the ambitions, because that was kind of part of the problem. Was it was so much time and money had been thrown at getting to the moon first, that even though there was an infrastructure for how to do it, it was still, in the minds of people in the late 60s, early 70s, it was insanely expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of had to go back and build an infrastructure that was, cheaper, if nothing else. But it is one of the great tragedies of recent American history that Apollo was kind of abandoned when it was, because we were, the infrastructure was in place. Yes, it was expensive, but the entire cost of Apollo from the early 60s into the 1970s cost less than a year of the Vietnam War did in its height. And I would argue we probably got a lot more out of Apollo than we did out of going into Vietnam.
You get an argument from me on that, man. That's a good point. I would say though that the the space shuttle, though it yielded some positive results, I think that was the wrong direction for the space program to go.
Yeah, you'll get no argument from me there.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think that was a way too expensive for what it actually, what the investment yielded, versus sending up many more rockets would have done.
yeah. I mean, it was a spacecraft designed by committee. Let's be perfectly honest, and it people
and that
forget.
never goes well, right?
Yeah, and it didn't go well. I mean, the whole thing was the kind of this product of, I think, there's some documentary evidence for it as well, that Nixon really wanted to kill manned spaceflight after Apollo. My own personal feeling is he was still sore about it being so associated with the Kennedys. That he just about killed manned spaceflight in 1972. And it was actually Caspar Weinberger, who was later became Secretary of State, not Secretary of State, excuse me, Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan, who basically sent this memo to the White House and said, think about the loss of technology and the loss of international prestige if we just stop. And the shuttle was basically the cheapest option out of this big blueprint that NASA had come up with. Thomas Paine, who was the administrator at the time of Apollo 11, had dreamt up this great vision of what we could do, and it involved space stations and a moon base and going to Mars in the 1980s, and indeed a space shuttle to get to the space station. I mean, the biggest problem with the shuttle is the simple fact that it didn't have anywhere to go. It was a craft without a destination. Saturday Night Live did a sketch years ago making fun of the HBO miniseries From the Earth to the Moon, and they did it about the shuttle, and they called it From the Earth to the Area Around the Earth. It's on an episode that David Duchovny hosted, so from the late 90s. And if you can find the sketch on YouTube, it's worth watching. I am such a nerd. But that was the shuttle. The shuttle was an amazing piece of technology and an incredible flying machine, to be sure. But fundamentally, the idea behind the shuttle was it would make getting into space, it would make, it would be cheaper, it would be more accessible, we could do more. And, the shuttle program ran for 30 years. And we were no closer to the moon. We were no closer to Mars. We were nowhere near fulfilling the visions of what a lot of people thought we would do in the late 60s, early 70s.
I think probably one of the good or the best ideas that came out of the space shuttle was having reusable equipment, reusable vehicles. And even though the rockets that they used were not reusable, at least the vehicle itself the craft itself was reusable.
Yeah. I mean, the ironic thing about the shuttle is that the shuttle was there to replace the Saturn V, really, because the Saturn V was so expensive to launch, at least according to the Nixon administration and members of Congress of both parties. The ironic thing is that by the time the shuttle retired, adjusted for inflation, it cost more to launch than a Saturn V did. And it didn't have anywhere near the lifting capability, or indeed the ability to get humans from the Earth to the moon or anywhere else in the solar system, for that matter.
Right. Well, and the advancements that we've seen just in the last decade with the reusable rockets, and the that test that they did the other day. Did you see that one with the Starship?
I did.
Wasn't
that
that was like watching a building lift off the ground with rockets and move 50 meters or so?
Yeah, I think it was about 500 feet, 500 feet up, and I can't remember how direction horizontally. Yeah. But it's like something out of science fiction.
It was crazy looking. Yeah, it was just so fascinating to see this new surge in the I don't know if it was correctly be termed a space race, because even though we're working not in concert with China, Russia, even the European Space Agency, we're not directly in competition with them. I guess unless I mean, unless you see it that way.
I mean, it's a space race light in many respects. I mean, the Chinese are very clear that their intention is to build a moon base and to get to Mars eventually, and that's been their timetable for quite a while now. And there's the Russians have been trying to do stuff independently. In the mid 2000s. They were developing at Energia the stuff for a Russian Mars mission, and never quite could get it off the ground. And indeed, one of the interesting things is that if the Cold War hadn't ended, if the Soviet Union hadn't come apart at the end of the 80s, early 90s, the Russians did have very serious plans for Martian flybys in the 1990s. Using the same technology, the whole the technology from Mir, because the whole point of the Mir space station was to develop the long duration space flight knowledge and experience to eventually do interplanetary travel. And it just things fell apart, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Well, there was a documentary I was just watching a couple of days ago about the Russian space program, and what it could have been propaganda, who knows, but their argument was that the Russian space program, although they made significant milestones, their technology was not advancing. They were using the same technology and just achieving new goals with the same technology.
Oh yeah, I mean that's not. I don't think that's a controversial opinion. I mean, there's a Cold War group I'm a member of on Facebook, and occasionally a meme will pop up of all the Russian space firsts, and then Americans being the first to the moon. It's like, how did America win the space race? And you have to explain that very fact to people that the first the craft that was used for the Voskhod missions, which is the first 3-person crew and the first spacewalk, was basically Vostok, which was the 1-person spacecraft they had built before then. And it's basically the same technology. It was the same technology. It was the reason the Russians ultimately lost the race to the moon. That and the death of Sergei Korolev, who was their chief designer, was the fact that the Russian technology couldn't keep up with what we were doing. And they also just didn't have the experience with rendezvous and docking to be able to do it. I mean, the Russian space program is fascinating anyways, because it was, we were just talking about the shuttle being designed by committee. I mean, the Russian space program was very much a committee-led effort. You had Korolev at the top, who was the chief designer, but even he was taking orders from Khrushchev and Brezhnev to actually make things work. And indeed, a lot of the reasons why the Russians had so many space firsts was because the Kremlin, anecdotally speaking, the Kremlin would call and be like, the premier would like you to put the first woman in space. You have 6 months. Get to work, and hang up the phone and go, well, how the blank are we going to do this? So the Russians had a lot of the first, but technologically they were behind the ball to a large extent. I mean, you look at the N1, which was their Saturn V equivalent, and instead of building the massive F1 engines that we used on the Saturn V, the Russians just decided, well, we've got a bunch of smaller engines that work, so instead of developing big engines, we're just going to put a whole bunch of small engines. I mean, the N1's first stage alone had something like 30 engines on it, and that was the reason why the thing never successfully flew. I think there were 3 launches of it, and not one of them ever reached orbit. I think the most successful of them lasted about 75 seconds. And again, it's the problems of running 30 engines all at the same time. And if any more than 1 or 2 of those engines go out, you are in serious trouble. And indeed, there was a launch of the N1 that happened just before Apollo 11, like 3 weeks before the Apollo 11 launch, where the thing barely got off the pad, and it was something like 8 or 10 engines shut down, and the whole thing just came right back down on the launch pad and blew up with the force of a small nuclear weapon, to the point that when the Corona spy satellite flew over later and the CIA's photo analysts got it back, they seriously thought a nuclear bomb had gone off in the middle of Kazakhstan, because that was what it looked like. So, I mean, the Russians were first in a lot of things, and it has to be said, if you look at like Soyuz, for example, Soyuz is still flying after, 55 years almost. I mean, the first flight of it was in 1967, went horribly wrong, but to their credit, they learned their lessons from that first Soyuz flight. But, that the technology from that worked. And I think the Russian mentality when it's come to a lot of space hardware has been, if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Yeah, that's true. Because they don't have the same amount of capital to throw at their space program that we do. So they have to scrimp and cut where they can so that they can still continue to compete.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only the capital to throw at, but it was the technology for that matter. I mean, trying to think of what it was. If you look at Buran, which was the Soviet equivalent to the space shuttle that flew. I mean, you can Google pictures of it online. It looks just like our space shuttle here. And I would not be surprised if it turned out that they got their hands on a fairly complete set of blueprints and basically decided they were just going to build a replica of it. They couldn't keep up technologically with us, and that was a big part of their problem as well. And that was true across a lot of things, but especially in computing. There's a wonderful book called Red Plenty, and I'm blanking on the name of the author, but he's British. And it's kind of a semi-nonfiction, semi-fictional. And it's about the Khrushchev era, when there was a real genuine idea that by 1980, the Soviet Union was going to overtake the United States in the West in terms of its GDP and its industrial development, and looking at exactly how that fell apart. And the simple answer to that is that for all the central planning the Russians did, there was no way to manually sit down and come up with all the calculations and all of the variables and all of the data and do the number crunching to make it work. And, the Russians invested actually in their own supercomputer programs, at least what for the time would have been considered supercomputers. And the basic problem is that because they were so technologically behind, they were a good 5 to 10 years behind the West and the United States in terms of computer technology, which is part of the reason why they couldn't keep up. And they were reliant, in fact, on a lot of industrial espionage to keep it going. Christopher Andrew, who's the great historian of Cold War espionage at Cambridge University, once said that the Soviet Union after the Second World War was as powerful as it was because of the ability to get weapons information and technological information out of the West back to the Soviet Union where they could copy it. But they were always going to be that little bit behind.
Did you become interested in science fiction first, or in the actual space program itself?
Oh, I think at a very young age, the two were kind of inseparable in my head, I suspect. One led to the other. It's the chicken and the egg, but I can't tell you which one came first. But I was the weird kind of kid who my parents would go to the local public library here and check out VHS tapes. And I was as content to sit down and watch episodes of Star Trek, the classic Star Trek from the 60s. I was a big fan of that, as was my dad. It was one of the things we bonded over, funnily enough, was Star Trek. But I was also content to sit there and watch NASA documentaries that the library had. So my parents would, I would sit there and watch an episode of Star Trek, and then I would be very happy to watch, something about the Apollo 15 mission or the space shuttle. So one kind of led to the other in a very kind of weird way. And I think as I got older, you can separate fact from fiction. But from a young age, I think if it was space, I was interested in it. As I got into kind of, I think we would term it today young adult. As I got into that point, I was getting very interested in history, which is where my interest in the Cold War came from. But I was interested in sort of American history in general, but a real big focus on the Cold War. The History Channel at that point was still showing, history programming. And I can remember begging my parents to let me stay up late to watch documentaries on the History Channel. There was a book called Blind Man's Bluff about Cold War submarine espionage, came out in the late 90s. I was about 10 or 11, and I remember begging my parents to stay up to actually watch that and to get to record it on VHS, and I watched the heck out of that.
Wow.
And eventually, as I got a little bit older, I was reading at quite a high reading level for somebody who was my age. I was reading on a high school reading level at like 10 or 11. So my parents would take me to the library, and I'd wander over, do a search for various topics, and walk out of the library with a stack of books that were, adult reading, and would sit there and read it and comprehend it and want to have conversations with it. And I think one of my frustrations about growing up when I did where I did was I didn't have very many people to talk to about that. I was a very, very nerdy child with who didn't have a lot of friends as a result. I probably made it sound worse than it was. I was frequently bullied, I'll put it that way, but it wasn't an incredibly lonely, depressing childhood by any means. But it was very much, I had friends, I had people I could play with and talk to and whatnot. Funnily enough, when I really wanted to talk history and stuff, I would, yap the ears off my history teachers. And I was kind of blessed in middle school and early high school by history teachers who were willing to put up with what I'm sure was a, very talkative, quite precocious, youngster who had a real passion and interest in it. And it just kind of blossomed from there, really. I didn't get to go to college, sadly. And I kind of regret that, because I'd love to have focused on history, but I have no idea what I would have done with a history degree, because I would have been useless as a high school history coach, as a high school history teacher turned sports coach. I would have been absolutely useless.
Well, because really, what can you do with a history degree other than historian or, teacher, college professor, or a writer, which is, I mean, what do you do for work right now?
I am a bookseller at a college, funnily enough. I work at a college bookstore.
Okay.
So I sort of view myself as contributing to the education of others, and I guess getting the education I unfortunately didn't get to have. But that's a whole story for another time. But I enjoy the job, and it's afforded me a lot of opportunities to chat with people who think I have a degree that I don't have a degree. Which I always find funny, because I've sat there and yapped off the ears of history students and history professors who want to know where did you get your degree? Where did you go to school from? What's your degree? And what was your thesis about? It's just kind of like, I don't have any of that.
So much emphasis is put on those accolades that that's the focus for education, is to get that piece of paper that says you completed it.
Yeah.
And where that's a mistake is that you tend to gloss over a lot of the important details and facts that somebody with a passion like yours is going to retain, because you do it because of the love of the topic, not because you're trying to get a piece of paper. So, I mean, hats off to you. I don't have a college degree either, but I've gone to college off and on to learn a new skill when I wanted to. But never had the discipline to stay with college long enough to get a degree.
I think that was part of my thing too. Is I'm not sure. I was one of those students where if it was a class at a subject I was passionate in, I did really well. But if it was something that I had no interest in or no aptitude for, I did terrible with it. I mean, the way I sort of talk about my sort of past is when people ask me about high school, and I tell them, well, I did great in English and history. Unfortunately, I bombed high school math like the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which is to say completely, totally, and utterly.
Yeah. Well, you can join my club, because I did not do well in math either.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah, no, I was not good at math, but I was really good at history. Loved history. And that's because I had a teacher in high school who made history so interesting that I couldn't get enough of it. I guess we'll skip ahead right now and talk about your book and your series of books, because I couldn't find all your books, but I did see that there were several books in a series that you've written.
Well, I've only written one of the books in the series.
Oh, really?
It's
Okay.
it's a series that's sort of written by a bunch of people. That's for those who don't know, it's the Silver Archive from Obverse Books, which is based out of the UK, and it kind of spun off. Funnily enough, talking about Doctor Who, the Obverse had done a very successful series of books called The Black Archive, which is named after something on the TV show Doctor Who, which is basically a British equivalent of Area 51. But I digress. The idea of those books was that they were taking, because Doctor Who's run for 50 odd years at this point, and the idea is that there'd been quite a bit written about it, but the idea was you could take a serial from Classic Who, which is 1963 to 89, or an episode or two from the current run of the show that started in 2005, and you could do kind of a critical analysis essay looking at the themes and the production of it and what the story was about and reception to it and anything and everything. And that had been very successful. And Stuart Douglas, who runs Obverse, looked at what the wider world of what the British call cult TV. So it's anything that kind of has a very loyal following. It may not have run very long. It may have run for years and has just dropped out of popularity, but things that had a certain audience for them that could stand up to a certain analysis. And having done the Black Archive, they simply decided to call it the Silver Archive. So other authors in the range have written about a series from the late 70s, early 80s called Sapphire and Steel, for example. And there's a book on Stranger Things, the first season of it, that was written by a buddy of mine. And there's a whole series of books coming out about various different shows. Another buddy of mine, Robert Smith, is writing a book about Millennium, which was kind of an X-Files spinoff that ran on Fox in the mid-late 90s.
Yeah, I saw the I don't know if was that a one season show?
I can't remember if it was 2 or 3.
Oh, okay.
But it was, as much as I watched the X-Files, my parents would not let me watch Millennium. And from what I've seen of it since then, I don't blame them. I wouldn't have let me watch it either.
Yeah, it wasn't as long lived as the X-Files. Man, the X-Files were such an influential program.
Yeah.
And that was starting up right as you were starting to become aware of science fiction, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the first episode of it aired in 93. And I can actually say, being that kind of nerd, I have a memory of watching the second episode of the show.
Wow.
Sitting in front of a TV. My brother was born in December of 93. And I think X-Files started, I think, in like September or October. And we were in between houses. We ended up in a department in Huntsville for a few months. For reasons I can't quite remember, but that's neither here nor there. But I have a firm memory of sitting on the couch that we had in that apartment, watching the scene in the second episode of the show where Mulder has sneaked onto this military base, and this big flying big triangular UFO flies over him, and then he gets captured by the military, and they inject him with stuff. I have almost a clear as day memory of watching that.
That's cool.
And it was also, I was also, as a kid, I was also, maybe because of my interest in science fiction, but I was also watching things like Sightings, which also aired on Fox. That may have come out of the fact that that was the famous footage, I think it was from STS-48, the famous footage of ice particles that may or may not have been UFOs in a supposed test of some kind of Star Wars defense system. And I remember that being featured on there and watching that segment. But I kind of got into UFOs in kind of and at least at an entry level way from a fairly young age, watching things like Sightings and the X-Files.
Cool. Well, that was a segment that I wanted to talk to you about, was the UFOs and aliens. Do you want to talk about that first, or you want to go back about the book?
Whatever you want to do. It is your show.
Well, we're kind of all over the place because there's so many interesting topics that we can talk about, and they kind of intermingle. So it's kind of hard to keep it structured because it's just so much interesting stuff. Now, okay, since we started talking about the book, and the name of your book is The Silver Archive #5, Dark Skies.
Yes.
And it's based on the TV series from the 90s, or was it the 80s?
The 90s. It ran from 96 to 97 on NBC.
Okay. And that TV series was also called Dark Skies.
Yes, it was.
What was that about? I never saw that show.
So Dark Skies was set in the 60s. And the whole premise of the show is summed up by a line from its opening credits, which is that history as we know it is a lie. And the premise is that in July 1947, an alien spacecraft did show up at Roswell. And there was a meeting between these aliens and Harry Truman, and the aliens basically demanded our unconditional surrender. And from there, the Roswell incident as we know it happened, the flying saucer was shot out of the sky, and there was the creation of this agency known as Majestic, who, if you're into UFO lore at all, you'll know, if I say the words Majestic 12, you will very likely know what I'm talking about. And the whole premise of the show is that from 1947 onwards, the show picking it up in the 60s, there's been a shadowy conflict between Majestic on the one hand and a race of aliens known as the Hive, who are this kind of ganglion-like creatures who took over the Greys, their planet took them over and took over their technology, and basically Earth is next. And that since the 1960s, there has been a shadowy conflict between the two that has had an influence on real events. So everything from Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane over Russia in 1960 to the JFK assassination, the Beatles' first appearance on American TV in 1964, Carl Sagan, Jack Ruby, you name it, it's all part of this conflict that supposedly went on between the two of them. So there's a wonderful description that I use as a chapter title in the book that was from a critic when the DVD set for the show came out. It is that, if you want to sum it up in one line, it's Mad Men for the Close Encounters set.
So you're talking about you're referencing the TV series Mad Men.
Yeah, because they're both set in the 60s, and there's a lot of attention to detail of getting things right in terms of hair and clothes and design, but also the historical events and kind of the wider thematic stuff of what's going on in this decade. The show starts with JFK and the New Frontier, and it ends with Vietnam War protests and the Summer of Love and LSD. So it's a very interesting trajectory for the show to go on.
Where could somebody go to watch that if they wanted to? Is that even available anymore?
It is. It's available on DVD. Shout Factory in 2011 did a magnificent DVD set of it, which is the place. If you want to see the show, get that DVD set. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of the show's creators, because the show is owned by Columbia and later Sony, it's not streaming anywhere as of the moment. But I know that Bryce Abel and Brent Friedman, who were the show's creators, have basically been waging a battle with Sony to try and get them to put the show on streaming somewhere where people can see it. But it is currently available on DVD.
All right, that's interesting, because it sounds like a really fascinating TV series. But was it 1 or 2 seasons?
It was 1 season. I mean, they pitched it with this big black binder that was modeled on the Majestic 12 documents. And you had to break the seal on it, and it had a big whole thing at the beginning about you were being read into classified information, et cetera, et cetera. And they had a big 5-year plan for the show, and it would have started in the 60s, and it would have gone to about 67 in that first season. It would have gone from the late 60s into the mid 70s. So 1968 to Watergate in the second season, picked up in the mid 70s, early 80s in the third season, done the 80s and 90s in its fourth season, and then in its fifth season, which would have been 99-2000, it would have caught up to the present day. So it would have been a whole journey. They had a plan for this whole journey through the latter half, basically, of the 20th century, and dealing with a lot of Cold War stuff along the way.
It sounds like it sounds like one of those shows that was probably just too far ahead of its time.
It probably was. I mean, they went in with a 5-year plan. I mean, you think about the X-Files that we were talking about a minute ago, and the way it sputtered out because simply I think out of the fact that they didn't know where they were ever going. Or they kind of did, and then they went past that point, and then they basically had to make it up as they went along. And they couldn't get away with not contradicting themselves, which I think is the biggest problem with the latter day X-Files. Is basically just become both self-involved but also self-contradictory. But they went in with a plan and basically said, we are not going to be one of those shows that, starts off brilliantly. And they basically go, well, we don't know where we're going to go. And instead, they basically walked in with a plan and said, we're starting here and we are going to end here. And here's some of the stuff we're hoping to do along the way. And, Bryce has said that the whole point of doing the show was that they were going to tie in with all of these historical figures and events. So you do have Cold War milestones that are in there. In that first episode alone, you start with Francis Gary Powers over, chasing a hive ship over Russia. And Alan Dulles, who was the longtime director of the CIA in the Eisenhower and early Kennedy years, is a member of the Majestic 12 board who's controlling the agency. So he's like a reoccurring character in the show. And there's also the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, in the first episode ends with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And it's a huge amount of range if you think about a show, just doing its opening episode. And they tied in. There's the third episode, which is actually the first one I saw on TV in '96, was the space race. They were focusing on Majestic basically hijacking a NASA test launch, which actually did happen. There was a Saturn I launch at the end of January 1964, and they based an entire episode around it. There's an episode dealing with the early days of the Vietnam War as well. And they're also Majestic, as in the way it's portrayed in the show, is very much a stand-in for agencies like the CIA with MK Ultra and doing kind of very questionable things in the name of, national security and, defending the country. And, it's a very interesting way to look at it. And there was one of the things that fascinated me about the show was if you drew a Venn diagram of a lot of my interests, Dark Skies would be in the middle of it. And when I first watched the show in 2013, I said, holy crap, how has nobody written a book about it? But B, if nobody else is going to write the book about it, I'm going to be that person. And it only took me 3 years and 3 different publishers before I found somebody crazy enough to let me do it.
And what is the book about?
So the book is kind of, I want to say it's a critical analysis of the show, but that makes it sound like it's dry and academic. And I did absolutely everything in my power to make sure that that is not how the book reads. So it's basically an examination of the show and where it ties in with real life, whether that's the real elements of the UFO lore that's been built up. So the whole first chapter is basically taking apart how the show deals with everything from the Majestic 12, Roswell, cattle mutilation, black helicopters, secret space programs, you name it. The second chapter sort of deals with the question of disinformation, because there's a really strange encounter that happens between the show's creators, Bryce and Brent, the night their first episode aired, and there was a big party held at Bryce's house up in the hills outside Los Angeles, and a guy showed up claiming to be from the Office of Naval Intelligence, wanting to help the show get things right.
Cool.
And there's a whole.
What did he say? What did he do?
So it starts off at this party, and the way Bryce and Brent have told it is there was a couple of hundred people at the house. It was all cast and crew. You had to be invited. Everybody, as they came in, were given a fake Majestic 12 badge, which was modeled on Bob Lazar, who supposedly worked at S4 near Area 51, his badge that, of course, had been in circulation. And they weren't really interested in watching the show because they had seen the pilot, because fun fact, there's 2 different versions of the Dark Skies pilot. For the very simple reason that Steven Spielberg did not want the show to feature the Men in Black, because it was around the time he was producing the Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones movie. Mm-hmm. So there's 2 different versions of the pilot, one with the Men in Black, one without. So they had, as Brent put it to me, they had seen both versions of the pilot about 200 times. and Brent was kind of wandering around the house, sort of gauging other people's reactions. And there were TVs set up everywhere so people could watch wherever. And he went out on Bryce's back porch just to kind of have a minute during a commercial break, just to kind of to himself. And as he put it, this sort of clean-cut, mid-20s guy just kind of wanders out of the backyard and walks up to him and says, you know, we've seen your show, and we think you've got a lot of things right, but we think we could help you do more. Okay. And the two kind of strike up a conversation, and at one point, trying to convince Bryce, who's shown up at this point, and Brent as well, that he is in fact genuine, he gets a napkin and he writes down, as they described it, this weird kind of equation thing and hands it to them. And Brent asks him, well, what's this? And the guy tells him it's the secrets of the universe, sound, light, and frequency. You know, hang on to this, because a few years from now, that's going to be in the public domain, and you'll know I'm right. But anyway, there's a whole party being held, and the two of them have got other things to be doing besides talking to a complete stranger who's wandered kind of into the party. Because the thing is, nobody knew who he was. He hadn't shown up with anybody. He didn't even have one of the badges. So the guy's like, we'll be in touch, and just kind of, again, you know, goes into the night, you know, fades into the night just like as soon as he appeared almost. And he ends up calling the production office on the Columbia backlot. And there's a meeting that's held within the week between Bryce, Brent, the guy from the party who calls himself JC, and JC's supposed superior, who is, Bryce described it, was clean-cut, military, late 40s, early 50s, kind of had an attitude of, I can't believe we have to talk to you guys, but we'll talk to you. And as they described it, they spent 2 hours basically spinning this entire yarn about, you know, everything that had been going on since Roswell, and, you know, that the show had gotten a lot of the details right, but it had gotten so much wrong. And at one point, the superior officer pulls out this tube, sort of vial, out of his pocket, full of something that looks like gold or fool's gold, and sort of puts it down on the desk and goes, for one thing, you guys don't have this in your show. And they ask the obvious question, which is, well, what is that? And the guy tells them, this is why the aliens are here. This is what it's all about. And the aliens have been mining this on the moon for years, but they've just about mined it out there. So they've been moving things here to Earth. And that's why everybody, you know, why people are seeing things. And we think that you guys could help get the truth out. Because if you were to believe these two guys who had shown up, who eventually said they were from the Office of Naval Intelligence, that there had been a cover-up that had been ongoing since at least Roswell. And what it basically had happened is there were these two kind of major factions controlling everything. There was a group of Air Force people called the Aviary, and there was a group of Navy people called the Aquarium. And that the Aviary wanted to keep things quiet and covered up and hushed up for whatever reason, and that they were part of this Aquarium group who wanted to get it out. And after the 2 hours was kind of over with, you know, I think the guys apparently had sensed that Bryce and Brent still weren't 100% convinced. And they were like, okay, here's what we can do. We can read you guys into things more. There's an admiral. He's on a ship out at Long Beach. And you guys can meet with him, and he can read you into things. But you can't meet him on the base. You definitely can't meet him on the ship. That would give the game away. So you'll have to meet him off the base. Okay, well, where are we going to meet him? And their response, I kid you not, was a cemetery in Long Beach at midnight.
That's starting to sound a little shady to me now.
Exactly. And that was exactly the point that Bryce says. He pushed away from the table, stood up, and went, I have a show to run. I have a wife. I have children. I am not meeting you or anybody else in a cemetery at midnight. Good day. So it's just a very strange story. And I kind of come at that from the angle of the stories that we've had in ufology of people like Paul Benowitz and Robert Emenegger. The Benowitz story, I think, has a lot of bearing on it, because for those who don't know the story of Paul Benowitz, he was a World War II veteran and electronics genius by all accounts, was a contractor doing electronics work for both the Air Force and NASA. And he had an interest in the subject and lived near Kirtland Air Force Base. And in the late 70s, spotted that there were some strange things happening around and above the base and became convinced it was aliens. And he shows up at the base, basically using his clout as a defense contractor, gets a meeting with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and basically goes, I think there's an alien invasion going on with the base. And for whatever reason, the AFOSI, specifically through an agent named Rick Doty, instead of dismissing him outright or taking him to one side and saying, it's not aliens, it's classified projects, you're a veteran, you were in the military, we're sure you understand, please don't delve into this, they led him down the garden path. And they spent years and eventually ensnared a whole group of people from ufology, including Bill Moore, who was one of the early investigators of Roswell, Linda Moulton Howe, who's a name I'm sure anybody who's interested in the topic probably recognizes even today, roped all of them into believing all kinds of really strange stuff that was supposedly going on in New Mexico, in the New Mexico desert around particularly Dulce. The infamous Dulce base of UFO lore is born out of this disinformation campaign that was aimed at, particularly at Paul Benowitz, but at the wider world of ufology. And to this day, nobody can quite explain exactly why they decided that the UFO community was worth targeting. And certainly pumping full of disinformation and other information that was perhaps true, but of, questionable sourcing, that's now become the focus of now 30-odd years of UFO lore.
Yeah, that is a strange and disturbing story. And if it's true, which I think the part about Doty is true, but whether he was acting on his own or under orders from superiors is questionable.
Yeah, I for my money, from the research I did in the book, and certainly building upon Greg Bishop's work in a book called Project Beta, but also the British author Mark Pilkington, his book Mirage Men, both of which I highly recommend to people, along with my own book, of course. I don't think there's any doubt that Doty was acting on the orders of other people, but it raises the question of why was the UFO, what were they trying to protect? But if it wasn't in fact that the U.S. government knows more than it claims about strange objects and potentially creatures from outer space, what was going on that was so worth protecting that they spent God knows how much money, definitely years worth of time, and drove Bill Moore out of the UFO field altogether, and drove Paul Benowitz to the brink of insanity, because he ended up institutionalized by the end of the 1980s as a result of being told that there was the cattle mutilations and everything else was this harbinger of an alien invasion that was being apparently worked on alongside the United States government. You don't get a lot of modern ufology and a lot of particularly the UFO lore that's now entered the popular culture without looking at what was going on around Paul Benowitz and Kirtland Air Force Base in the late 70s, early 80s.
Mm-hmm. So do you go into depth on this within your book? Or is this just research that you did that supports?
I dedicated an entire kind of chapter to this story because I think it has some bearing on what happened with Bryce and Brent. Because the detail about them being from these guys from Naval Intelligence, being from the aquarium, and there being a group of Air Force people called the Aviary, is interesting because Benowitz and Moore had a group of Air Force sources, including Doty, who called themselves the Aviary. And it raises some very interesting questions about, who knows what, and was Dark Skies being targeted as part of perhaps maybe an effort at disclosure, but also a disinformation effort. Because at the exact same time that this is all going down, Rick Doty was working as a advisor on the X-Files in its early seasons, right when it's building a lot of its fundamental stuff about UFO lore and about government disinformation and whatnot. Rick Doty is apparently, advising the X-Files on what to do. So it certainly suggests that there's a possibility, and there's nothing concrete for it, at least not that I uncovered in my research, but there is the possibility that there was an effort being made to shape the popular perception of the idea of the UFO phenomenon, but also what the government does or does not know about it.
Do you know if Doty was active military at that time, or he was already separated from the military?
He retired in the late 80s, and his retirement was very well timed, shall we say. Howard Bloom in the early 90s, and Bloom is an award-winning journalist, been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, wrote a book called Out There, which looked at a mid-80s government investigation into the UFO field, including the whole story of Benowitz and the Majestic 12. And he spoke to the FBI sources who did the investigation on the Majestic 12 documents and couldn't come to a conclusion about it. And one of the reasons they couldn't come to a conclusion about it was that at about the point that they became aware of what was going on with Doty and Benowitz, when they could have used the fact that he was in the military to force him to be honest with his testimony, that was the exact moment that Doty retired from the U.S. Air Force. And as an FBI source told Bloom, we've knocked on every door. We've gone around D.C. knocking on every door we can think of to ask about these documents. And what we've discovered is the government doesn't know what it knows.
A lot of shady dealings going on with that story between Richard Doty and Benowitz.
Yeah.
And it does sound, I do see a correlation with what you were talking about with the creators of Dark Skies and these so-called naval intelligence people.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I mean,
so you tie that in together with your book?
Yeah, that's chapter 2 of the book. It's basically there's a whole 20-page essay dedicated to taking the story apart, looking at the disinformation story, the Benowitz affair, also the story of Robert Ebenegger, who was basically recruited by the Air Force in the early 70s to make a documentary on the UFO topic, and was promised footage of a landing at Holloman Air Force Base. And was shown apparently part of that footage, and then the Air Force withdrew the footage from his usage. So it raises a whole lot of questions, but it also, I think, gets to the heart of the matter, which is that without the Cold War, without the secrecy of the Cold War, you don't have the modern UFO phenomenon as we understand it.
How so?
You don't have. I think if whatever happened at Roswell hadn't happened in 1947, it's post World War II. The Cold War is already brewing. Carl Sagan famously was a skeptic of the phenomenon, but towards the end of his life, Sagan, who, as we later learned, had worked on classified Air Force and NASA projects, owned up to the fact that, given the secrecy of the Cold War and the need for secrecy and the push for weapons technology, if an alien spacecraft had fallen out of the sky, it was entirely reasonable that world governments, particularly the United States or the Soviet Union, would have covered up the fact as well as they could have.
So is the theory, if there was no Cold War and a crash recovery took place, then that would have been shared among the governments of the world?
It's a possibility, and it's sort of a theory I kind of developed after I was sort of done writing the book. And I had sort of had an interest in the phenomenon to begin with, and in the whole story of Roswell and the Majestic 12 and whatnot, but having did a deep dive on the topic for the book for obvious reasons. There's no point in writing about something if you don't know what you're talking about.
That's an interesting theory, and I think we'll explore that a little bit more later on. But getting back to the book,
okay.
How did you get involved in writing the book? How did you get introduced to the creators, and what gave you the idea to actually? Well, you told me that already. What gave you the idea? You just figured there should be a book about it, so you decided you were going to write it. But what were the next steps?
The next kind of step about it was really, as it were, finding somebody who was crazy enough to let me do it, i.e. a publisher. I had just had my first couple of essays about Doctor Who printed in a book rather than just being online. So I approached the publisher of that and that I got a somewhat enthusiastic email back saying, we have a lot on our plate. We'll be back to you in a few months. And that was late 2013, early 2014. And to this day, I've not heard a word from the publisher back on it. In the defense of that publisher, they were a small publisher. They are still in business. They are still publishing stuff. But there were 2 or 3 major projects that they put out that were supposed to be imminent then, that took more years to come out. So I just suspect that my email basically, got lost in the shuffle, as it were. I waited another year or two, and I found another publisher who was based out of the UK, who specialized in cult TV stuff. And I thought, okay, they published some books on some really obscure shows, so they seemed like an ideal place to go. So I got the pitch out, sort of tweaked it a bit, and sent it off to them. And I got an email back in about 20 minutes, which was exciting because I thought, oh, wow, is it that easy to pitch a book? And their email was along the lines of that they were actually getting out of printing new material. So they were going to keep their back catalog in print, but they were kind of getting out of publishing new stuff. And as interesting as it sounded, they didn't think there was enough of an audience to justify dedicating an entire book to the show. Thank you for your interest, but we just don't think this is for us.
Well, that was a little bit more of a courtesy than a lot of publishers will extend to writers.
Yeah, that is very, very true. And then with Obverse, it happened that I'm also a Sherlock Holmes fan. So I had reviewed a Sherlock Holmes pastiche I had gotten for Christmas in 2016, I think it was. As it happens, that book was written by Stuart Douglas, who I mentioned earlier, who owns Obverse, is their chief editor. And I had reviewed it for a website I write for called Work Factor, and he had seen the review and quite liked it. And he actually sent me some stuff that they had published for me to potentially review, at exactly to the point that some stuff happened and the website went on a 2-year hiatus. So I didn't get to review any of that stuff, but I was on his radar. So that when he decided that he was going to do the Silver Archive, I was on the email list. And it's at this point I really have to credit my best friend, because having gone through 2 different publishers and not really had any luck with it, I was just kind of convinced in my own head that there was no space in the world for a Dark Skies book. And my best friend talked me into it, and basically went, if you don't pitch it, you're gonna kick yourself later if somebody else writes the book. And so I pitched it, and to my surprise and delight, Stuart really liked the pitch and said, I'd like to commission you to do the book. And from there, it was research at that point. I mean, I had a fair amount of reading done already and a fair amount of knowledge, to the point that I really thought I wouldn't have to go buy anything else or delve too far into things. And then, of course, as I sat there and started writing what became the first 2 chapters of the book, I suddenly realized, okay, I don't know as much as I think I do.
You don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know, I guess.
Precisely. And yeah. It was discovering the gaps in my knowledge, but also the fact that a lot of my knowledge was, I don't want to say out of date, but my heyday for being really interested in UFOs and delving into the topic was back in the, throughout the 90s, early 2000s. And, years had passed between the two. So it was to an extent catching up. So I decided I wanted to fill in the gaps in my knowledge, really. So basically I spent the next year doing a lot of reading, watching, and listening, to kind of bring myself both up to date, but also to expand my knowledge. But also I found some new areas to talk about that I hadn't really thought of before, especially in sort of the later chapters of the book, in dealing with where the show, in fact, would have gone if it had gone to those 5 seasons. And it was kind of a stroke of luck that I managed to get in touch with both Bryce and Brent. Bryce had also written published around 2012, 2013, an alternate history novel called Surrounded by Enemies, about the premise of which was, what if JFK had survived the assassination in Dallas, if he hadn't in fact been killed. And I had read the book, and again, I'd reviewed it on Warp Factor, and Bryce had read the review, quite liked it. So much so that when the book got a second edition, after it won a Sideways in Time award, he actually put me in touch with the publisher to get them to send me the new edition of the book. So I kind of had his information handy. So when the book got commissioned, I emailed him and basically said, I don't know if you remember me. I reviewed your book, and you were, very kind to put me in touch with your publisher, etc. I'm writing a book about dark skies now, and I would love to talk with you and potentially Brent about what it was like making the show, what your thinking was, etc., etc. And he put me in touch with Brent, and I sent them both an email because they were both, we're busy, but we would love to help. And I sent them an email basically saying, okay, I'd love to sit down and let's schedule an interview. And I heard nothing. Sent another 2 or 3 emails over the next couple of months, didn't hear a word. And once again, they had said they were busy, and I just assumed, well, they've gotten busy and there's other things going on. And so I went about my research and whatnot and wrote in the entire first draft of the book and sent it in mid-October 2018, I think it was.
How long from the start of writing the book did it take you to submit the first draft?
It was 18 months from the time I was commissioned to the time I sent in the first draft. Of time actually spent writing, the first month or so after I was commissioned, I wrote a very long and not particularly good version of the first chapter. And I sort of paused on it for a bit to go and do research. And I also wrote a first draft of a Cold War spy thriller, but we can talk about that in a bit in the meantime. And then came back to the book, and I worked on it from pretty much steady July 2018 through October of 2018. So 6 months worth of writing, basically.
That's pretty good. So, and was this your first book?
Yeah, this was the first thing I had written of book length.
Wow, that's pretty impressive, actually. A lot of first-time writers struggle with that first draft.
Oh, I mean, it was the first chapter was, well, technically the first 2 chapters, because there's a parallel universe out there where this book came out, and the first 2 chapters are in fact one massive chapter. And one of my beta readers, a buddy of mine I sent the book to, came back to me and basically went, dude, this really needs to be 2 chapters.
How long is the book in total?
The book, this is the funny part of the story is that having not heard from Bryce and Brent, having went and wrote the book, the first draft I sent in was about 24,000 words, give or take. And then I got the first draft back and the notes from Stewart. And one of the things that had happened in the first draft was I had quoted a lot from the original pitch documents, which I had managed to find online. And because I had quoted from the pitch documents so extensively, partially for legal reasons, they felt, Stewart and his fellows at Obverse felt I really needed to get in touch with Bryce and Brent to both A, confirm that I was quoting from the genuine article, but B, also make sure it was okay with them that I was quoting so extensively from it. And so I emailed Bryce, and Bryce got back in touch with me and went, it's great to hear from you. I've been waiting to hear from you for 18 months.
So he wasn't getting your emails?
Apparently he wasn't getting the emails. And me and him later sort of joked that Majestic was just kind of reaching into the internet ether and just pulling them out. Just pulling them out as I was sending them. So he was like, well, I know the first draft is done. You sound like you're in between things. And there was, there were some extensive notes. I handed in what I can look back on now with the space of some time, and no, I handed in a quite good first draft, but it wasn't quite as good as it could have been. And that was, a good editor can do that, is sort of point you in the direction of saying, you clearly know what you're talking about, but remember, not everybody else is going to. But one of the things that happened is that having emailed Bryce to confirm it was real, Bryce was like, well, if you still want to sit down and talk to me and maybe talk to Brent about it, and we can send and see if we can dig through our archives and send you stuff, we'd still be up for it. And it also was about this time the book got delayed by about a year in terms of when it would be published. And I think this may be the rare case where a book being delayed actually improved it. Because in that time off I had, so basically February of last year, 2019, through about Thanksgiving is when I sent in the draft that got published. I talked with Bryce. I talked with Brent. I had quite a bit of correspondence with Bryce in particular, as well as interviewing him and Brent both over Skype. And Bryce spent 2 days going through, because he had kept a lot of the documentation from the making of the show. And I got sent a Dropbox folder full of production documents and early pitch stuff and timelines and everything else. And it was just kind of like, it was stuff that nobody had seen outside of the production team. And the book, as it now stands, is actually a third longer than it was when I first sent it in, because I had access to so much new material.
Yeah, it sounds like you got a really rich and detailed cache of information from the behind the scenes at the show.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much stuff I was sent that I couldn't incorporate all of it, which was the tragedy of it. There's stuff I would have loved to have been able to have included, but they're just, in terms of both what I had pitched and what I was writing and what Obverse was going to put out, but also word limits, because I think technically once we factored in the bibliography and the acknowledgments page and stuff, I think I technically broke my max word count. For what I was supposed to do with, in terms of, the maximum word count. I kind of just busted right through that. But it was certainly worth it. But some of the stuff I got was just incredible. One of the things I got was they had brought in a linguist who had developed this entire language for the hive to speak. So once the people got infected with the ganglions, they would act like normal people to an extent, but they would also communicate with each other speaking this language. So I have saved, on my external hard drive, but also the laptop I'm chatting on at the moment, I have this complete dictionary of how to speak hive. I have no idea what to do with it, but I have it.
Okay, it seems to me like, and if I'm not mistaken, isn't Bryce trying to get get the show back on the air for a new season?
Him and Brent have been involved in a campaign for several years now, but I think it kind of has picked up after the DVD came out from Shout Factory in 2011 to get a, not necessarily even a reboot, but just a continuation of it going. Maybe picking up in the late 60s, maybe picking it up slightly later on. Maybe a full-fledged reboot. They've got different plans, but it's because the show is owned by Columbia, and I think this is one of the big differences between American and British television. In the UK, a lot of shows are owned by the original writers and their original creators. Here in the US, a lot of it, virtually everything is corporately owned. You think, Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek, but it's owned by CBS and Paramount. In the case of Dark Skies, Bryce and Brent created it, but it's owned by what was then Columbia and is now Sony. So it's been basically trying to convince Sony to let them go back and finish what they started.
Can they build a website to feature all of this information that they shared with you, but to build interest and momentum behind the show?
I don't know. I hadn't really thought about that. I don't know if they have necessarily. I know both of them are still very active writers. Brent, in the year since, has contributed to everything from Star Trek Enterprise to the Star Wars Clone Wars animated series and Star Wars Rebels. So he's been very involved with that. In fact, scheduling him for an interview on Skype turned out to be easier said than done because he was working on 3 different scripts at the same time. Bryce has stayed busy as well. In fact, within the last couple of months, along with his wife Jackie, they actually signed a production deal for what's looking like it's going to be a limited series about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case. So, both of them are, and both Bryce and Brent are kind of very busy people. But it's a thought, maybe I should get in touch with them and see how they feel, about it. Because, like I said, I think it's about putting this stuff online. Or it may be that there's stuff in there that if they ever got the chance to go back to it, they might want to pull from the well from. So spoilers in a roundabout sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a definite thought. I may have to get in touch with them and ask about that.
So interesting. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about with the production of the book and the publishing of the book?
I mean, I was just, when I started writing the book, my kind of philosophy going into it was based in part on what the response I had gotten from the second publisher I had pitched to, was I thought that the audience for the book would be about 7 people. And it would be people who were both, knew a lot about the UFO subject, but were also Dark Skies fans. And I figured that had to be a pretty small audience. And what I've discovered in writing the book and since the book came out is to credit Stuart Douglas, who was the editor, there is in fact a lot of people who, when you mention the UFO topic and you mention the word Dark Skies, people who don't necessarily know the show, but they kind of vaguely remember it. So I'm kind of hoping that if nothing else, the show, the book might spur some new interest in the show and, get people to go and explore this kind of hidden gem of, mid-late 90s sci-fi, but also of pop culture, how pop culture looks at the Cold War for that matter. Because, the Hive in a roundabout sort of way, is kind of an extension of kind of the invasion of the Body Snatchers and Robert Heinlein's The Puppet Masters, which are these great works of alien invasion science fiction that are kind of born out of the Red Scare of the early to mid 1950s. And there's even a line in one of the later episodes of the show which features Colin Powell of future Desert Storm and Bush administration fame or infamy, depending on one's point of view. And he gets involved with Majestic at one point on a mission. And the lead characters of the show explain to him how the Hive operates. And he just looks at them and goes, "It sounds like communism to me."
Cool. And that's a direct quote from the character in the TV series.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it does tie into the Cold War. And I mean, it's hard to do anything from late 40s to early 90s that is not affected by the Cold War. It just permeated our entire life, and it still affects us to this day.
It does.
I think one of the questions I had for you about the Cold War is what, in your opinion, I mean, and this could spawn a whole new conversation and go on for hours if we wanted it to, but just in kind of a quick summary, what lasting effects do you feel that the Cold War has had on the world?
Wow, that's a whole nother hour's worth of conversation. But if you want the short answer to that, I think one of the definite consequences of it has been the rise of government secrecy the world over. And certainly, there is legitimate grounds for national security and for state secrets. That certainly are concepts that existed before the Cold War rolled around. But what I think is one of the things that's a direct result of the Cold War is that we ended up with the establishment of what, people like Richard Dolan and others have termed the sort of the national security state. And the idea that anything and everything can be cloaked behind the words need to know, top secret, national security, and the best interests of the nation, etc. And I think what's happened since the 90s, since the end of the Cold War, with the revelation of things like Venona, which was this multi-decade NSA project to take apart these just sort of intercepted Soviet communications, which ended up revealing a huge amount of information about who was and was not spying for the Russians, at least in the early days of the Cold War. And you also look at things like, human experimentation, be it MK Ultra, be it soldiers exposed to nuclear testing, or members of the unsuspecting members of the public who were subjected to germ warfare experiments, for example. And indeed, if we talk about the UFO subject as well, as I said earlier, you don't get the modern perception of the UFO phenomenon without the Cold War and without the secrecy of the Cold War. Because whether it's disinformation, as we talked about with Benowitz, whether it's a cover-up, and I think that anybody who spends more than a modicum of time looking at the documentary evidence that we have that's been declassified on this topic from the Air Force, the CIA, you can name any other number of three-lettered agencies. There was an effort made to hide what the government knew, or indeed the lack of what the government knew about this topic. And I think that all of that are the lingering effects of the Cold War. And indeed, as we've been watching over the last 3 years with ATIP, which was this more recently a Pentagon project examining the UFO question amongst other topics, and the layers of secrecy that were built around that. All of that, I think, is a legacy of the Cold War, and we're still very much living with it in dealing with the questions of national security.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. Excellent answer, by the way. But
a very serious answer, I suspect.
No, but an excellent answer nonetheless. And you're absolutely right that could easily be another hour and a topic for a whole other show. If I might just have to invite you back on here in a couple of weeks to do another show and talk about that specifically.
I would be up for that too.
Awesome.
To be sure.
Awesome. Okay. Well, stand by. So let's go back and, okay. First of all, you answered all the questions about the book that I had. Is there anything else about the book that you would like to mention? Number one, how can people get it?
Well, if you're interested enough to track down the book, you can buy it directly from Obverse, either as an ebook or in paperback. Obversebooks.co.uk, I believe. Because they're based in the UK, if you want a paperback copy of the book, and you're in the US, the cheapest place to actually get it, thanks to Amazon's distribution things not being exactly good for small publishers, let alone internationally small publishers. You can actually buy the book on Lulu. You can actually stick my name, Matthew Kresal, Dark Skies, into the Lulu search engine, and it'll take you right to it. If you're in the US, you want the paperback, buy it from Lulu. If you want the ebook, or you don't mind paying a little bit for international shipping, you can buy it straight from Obverse.
Okay, great. How long has the book been out?
It came out April the 10th. So it's been out just under 4 months.
Well, congrats on the first publication of your first book. That's a huge kudos. So we're going to close it out in a couple of minutes, but I want to hit on the UFO and alien topic just a little bit more before I let you go. What do you think crashed at Roswell?
Something out of the ordinary fell out of the sky there. The question remains, what fell, what it was. And I have to say, at the end of my research, having dealt with alien spacecraft, with Nazi flying wing bombers sent over from the Soviet Union, Nazi flying wings being flown by captured Japanese people from World War II, Mughal weather balloons, V-2 rockets, etc., etc. I have to say, at the end of all that, alien spacecraft is not the craziest thing I came across.
I'm reading a book right now called Witness to Roswell.
Yes.
Have you read that book?
I have.
Okay. That book has me convinced that it was alien spacecraft.
I mean, you look at the stack of witnesses, you look at the behavior of the U.S. military during and after the event. There's so much strangeness around it. And I know, if you haven't, Nick Redfern's 2 books on Roswell, Body Snatchers in the Desert and The Roswell UFO Conspiracy, are worth checking out as well. Nick Redfern has his own solution. He thinks it was a combination of captured access technology that we were experimenting with, combined with victims of Japan's Unit 731, who had done all kinds of biological weapons and mutilation and everything else.
Okay. without reading the book, I really the main thing that convinced me from this book, Witness to Roswell, is that the government didn't respond to the crash until 2 or 3 days later, when they were notified by a civilian. If it had anything to do, if it was any kind of test by the government, they would have known about it. Period. So that's that's why I'm convinced it was something not of this earth.
Well, I mean, they were launching weather balloons and stuff from the base at Roswell all the time, and Jesse Marcel and the others who went out to all the wreckage that Mac Brazel had experience with airplane wreckage. They had seen bits and pieces of V2 rocket. They knew anything and everything that this thing was supposed to be, and they didn't know what it was.
We are in total agreement on that, because that book just lays it out so succinctly and clear. It's hard to argue with those facts and the witness testimony.
The sheer amount of witness testimony at this point as well, and it's just kind of like, people are like, well, it's only a handful of people, and it's like, that's the other thing. When I was researching the book, I had some conversations with friends of mine who were skeptical about it, and you suddenly remind them that they have no idea. That, I don't know if this is the fault of the authors or their publishing company, or just that the media didn't pick the story up and run with it. People don't know that there's an entire book full of dozens of witnesses.
Hundreds.
Most of them are ex-military.
There's literally hundreds of witnesses, and yeah, ex-military, but members of the families. So there's just too much evidence that it was something the military knew nothing about. And if it was not something by the military, then what was it?
Exactly. And that only leaves so many alternatives at that point.
So I wouldn't call myself like a serious UFO researcher, but over the last, since I started my podcast, which was only a few months ago, and prior to that, I guess since 2017 is when I got a little bit more serious about the topic and looking into it and watching documentaries. So I'm relatively new. You seem to be a lot more well-versed on the topic.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that it's a rabbit hole that's very easy to fall down.
Definitely. Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
And the big problem with dealing with this topic is that there's so much disinformation out there. Part of it's, deliberate disinformation. Part of it is opportunistic hoaxers who have thrown stuff out there and it's just happened to catch on. It's sifting the wheat from the chaff and the nonsense.
Yeah.
That's the hard part.
You mentioned Richard Dolan, whose work, in my opinion, is impeccable. He's a very rigorous researcher. I've got one of his books, AD, After Disclosure. I haven't read it yet, but that's the next book.
Read it. That book is actually part of why I ended up writing the Dark Skies book, because that introduced me back to the series. I picked it up in 2013. At the time, I was working a fast food job. I was living with my grandmother then, and one of the things I would do, because she was in her 70s and doesn't drive, is I would take her shopping, and she would go into various stores in the shopping center that had a Barnes & Noble attached to it. And I actually walked into the Barnes & Noble one day, and the book was sitting on the shelf, and I went, well, this sounds interesting. So I picked it up, and it had the intention of, sitting down in the chair and browsing through the first 20 pages or so. And I was so engrossed in the book that I actually bought it before I could leave the store. I was not leaving the store without that book. But the book is co-written by Bryce Zabel, who co-created Dark Skies, and he references the show in a few places in there. And by the time I had finished reading the book, and it didn't take me that long to read it. Unfortunately, I was busy with other things, work and essay writing and everything else at that point. So it took me a couple of weeks to read it. But by the time it was over with, I went, I have to watch this show. So AD After Disclosure is inadvertently the whole reason I got back. I tracked down Dark Skies, which I had a limited knowledge of and had seen 2 or 3 episodes of.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. That's that. I didn't even mean to go that direction with it, but that's a cool anecdote about that book. The reason I mentioned Richard Dolan to begin with is because the whole concept of disinformation is something that Dolan is adamantly against. He hates disinformation, and
Yeah.
I do too. I feel like it's something that it should be criminal. It should be criminal if it's found out that the government is passing disinformation and it's proven, there should be consequences for that.
There ought to be. I mean, it amazes me that nobody went to jail over what happened to Paul Benowitz. You know, this is a guy whose life and career was ruined by a systematic, carefully thought out effort by his own government and the military that he had once served in. And nobody was prosecuted. As far as we can tell, a handful of people were wrapped over the knuckles. Yes, Rick Doty retired, but where is Rick Doty today? Rick Doty is out promoting that, yes, I did this, but I actually know some of the truth about it. And, you know, selling books to people and speaking at UFO events and going on people's radio shows and podcasts. But I think that they would justify that, you know, as I was talking about earlier, they would justify it under the grounds of national security. That it was the same way that some of the doctors and stuff who were involved with MK Ultra did.
I think there needs to be a distinction between protecting national security and disseminating disinformation
or actively harming people. I mean, you get no argument from me there, dude. You get no argument from me there.
Fact or fiction, Majestic 12?
Fact to at least a certain extent.
Okay. We'll explore that a little bit more in a future episode, if that's cool with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because there is a lot of evidence against Majestic 12, and there are a lot of very good researchers who totally debunk Majestic 12.
Yeah, and there's also a lot who believe it the other way. And
that's true.
And for me, and we can talk about this in the future, for me, the truth is somewhere in the middle between the two.
And for me, I don't have enough information to even make an opinion. I need to delve into that a lot more deeply before I can make an opinion.
For what it's worth, I don't know if anybody's necessarily got enough information to make an informed opinion.
Fair enough.
But people have anyways for 30-odd years now.
Rendlesham incident.
To the extent, as with Roswell, something happened. But whether it was, I think the evidence certainly is strong that there was something unusual in those woods. I would tend to lean towards the extraterrestrial explanation for that, simply because the alternatives, you know, whether it's lighthouses or the British SAS or most recently Nick Redfern throughout mind control experimentation. It's sort of using an inverted versions of Occam's razor here. It's one of those cases where alien spacecraft is the easiest explanation.
Okay. Kecksburg incident.
I don't necessarily think it was a flying saucer that was an alien spacecraft. I think there's circumstantial evidence of some kind of satellite falling out of the sky, whether it was Russian or maybe the US or US. That's a question, particularly since we know that the CIA was running various early spy satellite projects at that point.
Yeah, I did see a documentary that suggested that it was a satellite, and they showed some pretty compelling evidence of that. But there's also an interesting theory that it could have been this one's a little bit out there, but it's certainly the most interesting. The Nazi bell.
I was about to mention that because of all the solutions I've heard for Kecksburg, that's the one I buy the least. That the Nazis were experimenting with things like the Glock, the bell. I don't think there's enough circumstantial evidence to say that the Nazis were certainly interested in and experimenting with some very advanced technology from the 1940s. I don't necessarily believe that they got the stuff functioning let alone, as I think was presented on an episode of History's Ancient Aliens, that the thing somehow managed to time travel 20 years into the future with some Nazi bigwig on board.
Well, cool. So I'm going to wrap this up a little bit. And
All right.
I would love to sit here and talk to you for another 2 hours, but we'll save that for another episode.
All right.
So with that said, do you have any final thoughts before we end this?
Final thoughts. I suppose, as I said, that in sort of writing the book, it was sort of a crash course in a way, both a refresher course in the history of the Cold War, but also how the Cold War intermingles with the UFO subject, and through things like Dark Skies, also the way that we look at both UFOs as a topic, but also the Cold War as a topic through pop culture, and how very much you don't get one without the other. For people who are fans of science fiction, if you're interested in Cold War era lore and fiction, Dark Skies is well worth checking out. And certainly Bryce on Twitter the other day described my book as the perfect complement to the series, and I can think of no higher endorsement than that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is a huge endorsement. Now, if anybody was interested in getting in contact with you, I had a tough time finding information about you, but are you available for people to talk to?
Oh, yes.
And how could they reach out to you?
You can find me on Facebook. I have a page on there, facebook.com/KresalWrites, my last name and the word writes. And I'm on Twitter as well. My Twitter handle is @KresalWrites.
Okay, and the website, you write for several websites. Do you have one that you call your own?
I have a LiveJournal blog I've kept since about 2009 that I occasionally still post stuff on. It's the closest thing that I have to my actual website. The site I write for primarily these days is, I mentioned earlier, is Warp Factor. So warpfactor.com, and I cover all kinds of pop culture stuff on there as well. So that's one side of my writing, at least.
I saw that you do a lot of reviews and breakdowns of different things, different TV series and different books and things like that on that. That's one I did find where you contributed to quite a bit. It also looks like you have some entries on Goodreads. Your Goodreads profile looks like you keep a blog there.
Yeah, I think the Goodreads blog is linked to my LiveJournal one. So that's, timdalton007.livejournal.com is the address for that one.
Very cool.
So I am a James Bond fan, and Timothy Dalton's my favorite Bond. So
yeah, I like James Bond too. That's one of the British forms of entertainment that I do like.
Fleming himself, of course, had served in intelligence in World War II, but those books are very much informed by the early Cold War.
Yeah.
It's not a coincidence that the first Bond novel, Casino Royale, is written just months after Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean defected to the Soviet Union from the UK, having been spying since the 1930s. I don't think that's not a coincidence whatsoever.
Well, with that, we're gonna call this episode done, and we're definitely gonna have another conversation at a later date, as long as you're up for it.
Oh yes.
All right, my friend. Well, with that, I will let you go, and we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thank you very much again for having me, and looking forward to hearing from some people, hopefully.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah, if anybody's interested in your book, I hope they buy it. I'm certainly going to go get a copy of it as soon as I can track it down. And I look forward to talking to you again soon, Matt. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, take care now.
You too.
Dead Hand Radio is a podcast about the Cold War, its history, and the effects it had on our culture, technology, and the future of our world. My goal is to examine these and other topics, to learn, to educate, to entertain, and exchange ideas with those interested. So join me, and together we'll explore a fascinating period of history and examine some incredible advancements in weapons, technology, science, art, and culture, and discuss how all of it relates to the future of our world. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on this program, drop me an email or visit deadhandradio.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. I'm Andrew Hall, and this is Dead Hand Radio. Thanks for listening.